I've lived most of my life in Oregon, and anyone who's spent enough time here knows the forests can be both beautiful and unforgiving. They stretch endlessly in every direction, swallowing up old roads and forgotten trails, and if you're not careful, they'll do the same to you. I learned that the hard way about 7 years ago, during what was supposed to be a simple weekend hike near Broken Ridge, not far from the Willamette National Forest. It started out like any other trip. Hiking alone had always been my escape, and I figured a weekend off-grid would help me reset. I packed light but smart, with a tent, sleeping bag, and enough food and water for 2 nights. The plan was to hike into a lesser-known area off one of the logging roads, camp near a small creek I'd seen marked on an old map, and hike back out before Sunday evening. The drive out there took longer than I expected. The deeper I got into the forest, the fewer signs I saw of anyone having been around recently. Fallen branches covered parts of the road, and the trailhead marker was half-rotted and covered in moss. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt. The only sounds were wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the forest settling. I parked my truck on the side of the dirt road, locked up my phone in the glove box to disconnect completely, and started the hike with my backpack and compass. The first few miles were easy. The path was narrow and overgrown, but still visible. The air smelled clean, the kind of sharp pine scent that reminds you how far you are from everything artificial. I reached the creek before sunset, just like I had planned. It was calm and shallow, with a smooth flow that sounded almost rhythmic. I set up camp on a flat patch nearby, ate a quick meal, and fell asleep with the kind of tired satisfaction that comes from real quiet. I woke up early the next morning feeling refreshed. I decided to explore a bit farther up the ridge, just to see what was beyond the creek before heading back. I left my main gear behind, taking only a small day pack with a water bottle, compass, and some trail mix. The ridge was steeper than I expected, and the trees grew denser as I climbed. After a while, I noticed something strange. The forest started to feel heavier. The sounds had changed. There were no birds, no rustling in the underbrush, not even the faint buzz of insects, just an unsettling silence. Still, I pushed farther. The terrain got confusing. The incline curved one way, then another, and I started second-guessing my direction. When I finally stopped to take a break, I turned around and realized I couldn't see the creek anymore. I pulled out my compass, but the needle was spinning slowly, refusing to settle in one direction. I told myself it was just interference or maybe a magnetic rock nearby, but the unease started to build. I picked what I thought was the right direction and began walking again, but after another 30 minutes, the land didn't look familiar. The trees all looked the same, tall, gray-green trunks with thick moss hanging from the branches, blocking out most of the light. By the time I admitted to myself that I was lost, it was already past noon. I hadn't marked a path or left any indicators. I figured if I just moved downhill, I'd eventually find the creek again. That seemed logical, but downhill led to more forest, and the deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. I tried retracing my steps, but everything blurred together. The air felt different down there too, colder, heavier, like the woods themselves were watching. When the sun started to lower, I realized I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left. I had no tent, no map besides memory, and no real sense of direction. I found a small clearing surrounded by dead trees and decided to stay put until morning. I had enough water and a granola bar, but I barely touched either. I just sat there, listening to the quiet. The forest was completely still, and every so often, I'd hear faint cracking somewhere in the distance, like a branch snapping. It wasn't constant, but it came in intervals, one snap, then silence for several minutes, then another. I tried to convince myself it was just animals moving through the woods, though I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't random. That night was long. The moonlight barely reached through the canopy, and the temperature dropped fast. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something faint, movement that wasn't wind, like something pacing just outside the clearing. I never saw anything, but I felt it, that low pressure of being observed. I remember holding my pocket knife in my hand, not because it would help much, but because it was something. When dawn came, I felt weak from not sleeping. I decided I couldn't wait for help. No one knew where I was. I had to find my way out. I looked for sunlight direction, figuring east would eventually lead toward the road. I walked for hours, cutting through thick brush, tripping over roots, scraping my legs on thorns. But the strange thing was, no matter how far I went, I never came across the creek again. The terrain kept repeating itself. Same patterns of fallen logs, same slope angles, same patches of ferns. It felt like I was walking in circles, though my compass needle had finally stopped spinning. It was pointing steadily now, but it didn't make sense. It was directing me back uphill, the opposite of where I thought the road was. I followed it anyway, mostly because I was desperate for any direction that felt consistent. The forest changed again as I climbed. The trees got thicker, darker, and quieter. The ground was covered in patches of black moss, and every step felt muffled. The silence was so deep I could hear my own heartbeat. I remember stopping and realizing I could smell something faint in the air, something like old smoke or burned wood. I thought maybe I was near a campsite or remnants of a fire, so I pushed on faster. What I found wasn't a campsite. It was a section of forest that had been burned long ago. The trees were blackened husks, but some were still standing. The ground was ashy, but there was no sign of recent fire. It must have been years old. I wandered through it, thinking it might lead to a clearer area, but the deeper I went, the stranger it felt. The ground began to slope downward again, forming a narrow gully surrounded by charred trunks. I noticed shapes on the ground, not rocks or logs, but fragments of something else. I knelt and realized they were bones. Small ones at first, maybe from animals, but the farther I went, the bigger they got. Some were broken clean, others scattered in ways that didn't look natural. I didn't stay to find out more. The air was too still, and the smell of burnt wood had turned metallic, like rust or blood. I climbed out of the gully and kept walking in the opposite direction, pushing through until I found green trees again. My body felt drained, my throat dry. I walked until my legs shook, then collapsed against a log. I must have passed out, because when I opened my eyes, it was already late afternoon. Sunlight filtered through the trees differently now, brighter, more open. I realized the ground beneath me had changed texture. There was gravel mixed in with the dirt. I pushed myself up and saw a faint path ahead, barely visible, but clear enough to be man-made. I followed it, barely able to keep pace, until it widened into what looked like an old service trail. The sight of tire marks in the mud nearly made me cry. I don't remember much after that, except stumbling toward the sound of something distant, a river maybe, and eventually spotting a rusted metal gate. Beyond it was a dirt road that connected to one of the old logging routes. I followed it until I found my truck. It was nearly dark, and my phone battery was long dead. I sat inside the cab for almost an hour, just staring at the tree line, not sure what I had just walked through. When I finally drove back to town, I stopped at a ranger station to report getting lost. The ranger there looked at my map and said that area near Broken Ridge had been closed off decades ago after a wildfire. He said no official trails existed there anymore, and the ground was unstable because of the old burn zone. When I mentioned the gully and the bones, he told me that forest fires sometimes expose animal remains buried long ago. I nodded, but I didn't tell him everything. Not about the silence, the feeling of being followed, or the repeating terrain that made no sense. I've been back hiking many times since then, but never near Broken Ridge again. I still think about that burned section sometimes, the way it seemed to appear out of nowhere, and how the forest felt different there. I am Ethan. I used to live just outside Bozeman, Montana, not far from the Gallatin Range. It's one of those places that makes you forget civilization exists. Miles of mountain trails, alpine lakes, and thick timberland that stretches farther than most people could imagine. I grew up around the outdoors, and I always prided myself on being someone who could handle himself in the wild. In the fall of 2016, I had started taking weekend hikes alone to decompress after long work weeks. It became a ritual: load my pack, drive out of some quiet spot, and spend a night away from noise and people. I'd usually go to well-known trails, but by late October, I wanted something different, something quieter. A coworker had mentioned an old forest road past the main trails of Gallatin Canyon, said it used to lead to a hunting cabin that got abandoned years ago. I looked it up and found barely any information. The idea of a forgotten cabin sounded peaceful, so I decided that would be my destination. It was a Friday morning when I set out. The forecast said it would be cold but dry, though in Montana that can change without warning. The sky was heavy with gray when I parked my truck near a logging access point. The road was rough, with deep ruts carved by old tires and erosion, but it felt manageable. I should have taken the overcast sky as a warning, but I didn't. I threw on my backpack, double-checked my compass and map, and started walking up the unmarked path that disappeared into the timber. The forest was quiet that day. There wasn't much wind, and the higher I went, the more muffled everything felt. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel isolated, but calm at first. The ground was layered with pine needles, soft enough to muffle footsteps. After about 3 hours of steady climbing, I came to a narrow ridge that looked down over a small frozen creek. According to my map, the cabin should have been somewhere beyond that creek. I decided to keep going another mile before setting up camp, but the deeper I went, the more the landscape stopped matching what I'd seen on the map. The topography didn't line up, the creek twisted in directions it shouldn't, and the ridges rose steeper than expected. I checked my compass several times, but the readings were consistent. I figured I was fine, just slightly off course. I pressed on. Around late afternoon, the fog started to roll in from the west. It came fast, thicker than I'd seen before, wrapping through the trees like smoke. I lost visibility within minutes, and that's when I realized I'd made a serious mistake. I should have turned back right then, but instead I tried to cut across the slope, hoping to intersect with the old forest road again. The fog made everything feel distorted. Distances looked wrong, sounds bounced weirdly. My own footsteps seemed like they were coming from behind me. When I stopped to catch my breath, I realized I hadn't seen the creek again. The compass still pointed north, but my gut told me something wasn't right. I walked for another 20 minutes before I noticed how dark it was getting. I set my pack down and decided to pitch my tent before full nightfall. The temperature was dropping fast. I could see my breath when I exhaled. I gathered some damp branches to make a small fire, but the wood was too wet to catch properly. I managed a weak flame that smoked more than it burned. As night settled in, I sat there wrapped in my jacket, staring into the fog that had turned the forest into a pale wall. Every sound felt amplified: the crackle of my fire, the creak of frozen limbs above, the occasional fall of snow from branches. I tried to convince myself I was fine, but the unease was there, heavy and constant. I couldn't shake the sense that the forest had shifted somehow, like I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I barely slept that night. When I finally got out of my tent at dawn, the fog was gone, but the world looked unfamiliar. The trees were different, taller, older looking, with strange patches of dark bark peeling away in streaks. The slope I camped on led into a deep hollow I hadn't noticed before. I checked my compass again. The needle was steady, pointing north, but the direction didn't make sense. The sun was rising in the wrong part of the sky compared to where I'd come from the day before. I decided to move downhill, thinking I'd eventually hit the main creek that would guide me back toward the road. The descent was rough, and I slipped a few times on patches of icy moss. After an hour of walking, I noticed something off about the ground. It was covered with scattered bones, small and bleached, spread between the roots of the trees. They looked like animal remains at first, maybe deer or elk, but the distribution was strange. Some were buried halfway into the soil, as if they'd been there for years. The forest floor was uneven, and I realized there were slight mounds everywhere, like old burials or collapsed dens. I didn't linger long enough to find out. The more I walked, the less I recognized the terrain. I kept expecting to hit the sound of running water, but it never came. My GPS had died overnight, and I had no signal to recharge it. The temperature stayed low all day, and by late afternoon, the air had that still, brittle quality that comes before snow. I decided I'd need to find shelter before dark. I spotted a large rock outcropping with a shallow space beneath it, and figured it would block the wind enough to last the night. That evening, snow began to fall. It wasn't heavy at first, but it kept coming. My small fire hissed against the moisture, and I could barely feel my fingers. I sat there staring out at the treeline, and that's when I started noticing movement. Faint, slow shapes between the trees, far enough away that I couldn't make out details, just pale figures shifting behind trunks. I thought maybe they were deer, but they moved too quietly. Every few minutes I'd catch sight of one, then nothing for long stretches. I told myself it was just the light playing tricks through the snow, but deep down, I didn't believe that. That night, I didn't close my eyes once. Every sound in the forest felt deliberate. A shuffle of snow, a crack somewhere just out of sight, the faint echo of something brushing through branches. I didn't see anything clearly, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It wasn't fear in the usual sense. It was more like realization that there was something else out there, something that had always been there and didn't want me here. When dawn came, the snow had stopped, leaving a white silence over everything. My tracks from the day before were gone. I started walking again, not even sure which way I was heading. I followed the faintest decline in the land, figuring water always runs down. I was cold, weak, and my sense of direction was gone. I stumbled more than once and had to stop frequently. The forest around me seemed endless. I thought about using my flare gun, but I knew no one would see it. I hadn't seen a plane or even a distant road light since I got lost. By midday, I finally saw movement ahead. Not figures this time, but what looked like an old wooden structure between the trees. I forced myself toward it, half expecting it to vanish, but it stayed real as I approached. It was the cabin my coworker had mentioned, though it was barely standing. The roof had collapsed in the center, and one side was charred black, as if it had burned years ago. The windows were gone, and the door was hanging crooked. Still, it was shelter. Inside, the air was thick and stale, the smell of rot and old smoke. There were remnants of furniture, a metal bed frame, a stove rusted through, and what looked like old hunting gear scattered around. The floor was covered in animal tracks and dried leaves. I sat in the corner and tried to warm myself with what was left of my fire-starting kit. It barely worked. The air felt wrong inside that cabin. Heavy, like the woods themselves had pressed inward. As the light faded, I heard something outside again, faint crunching in the snow, slow and deliberate. I couldn't see anything through the door, just the white of the snowfall and the dark trunks beyond. The sounds came closer, then stopped, and for a long time, there was nothing but silence. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have blacked out from exhaustion. When I woke up, it was morning again, and the forest was quiet. No snow was falling. My body ached, but I knew I couldn't stay another night. I forced myself up and walked away from the cabin in what I hoped was the right direction. The sky was clear that day, and the sun finally broke through in thin shafts. I used it to gauge direction, moving west until the slope started to rise again. By mid-afternoon, I saw a clearing ahead, and when I stepped out of the tree lane, I nearly collapsed with relief. There was a power line cutting through the valley below. I followed it for hours until it led me back to a service road. When I finally made it to a ranger station, they told me that the cabin I described hadn't been standing for years. They said the land had been condemned after multiple fires and collapses from snow years back. When I mentioned finding bones and seeing strange shapes at night, the ranger told me that part of the forest had long been known for odd things. Hunters getting turned around, compasses failing, equipment malfunctioning. They chalked it up to magnetic interference and rough terrain, but the way the ranger avoided eye contact made me think they'd heard it before. It was 2014 when it happened. I'd been working long hours at a warehouse job near Scranton and hadn't had time to unwind. I wanted to get away from everything for a weekend, maybe take some pictures and breathe real forest air again. A friend of mine told me about Pine Hollow, said it was quiet and beautiful, with old trails that ran for miles before vanishing into state land. I checked online, found a few vague mentions of the area, and decided that's where I'd go. I left early on a Saturday morning. It was cool out, with that early autumn crispness in the air. The drive took about 2 hours, mostly through winding back roads that eventually turned to gravel. I passed only 2 other vehicles the whole way. The forest got denser the farther I went, thick pines, birch, and maples pressing close to the road. When I reached the trailhead my friend mentioned, it was little more than a gap in the tree line, with a faded wooden post. There was no sign, no map, nothing official. It didn't matter. I parked my car on the side of the road, loaded my backpack with supplies, and set out, thinking I'd just hike a few miles in, set up camp near one of the ridges, and hike back the next morning. The trail started out clear enough. Fallen leaves covered most of it, but I could still see faint indentations where others had walked before. The air was calm, and the forest felt alive. Birds calling, wind threading through the branches, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. I remember thinking it was perfect, peaceful, and untouched. I didn't realize then that it would turn on me so fast. About 3 hours into the hike, I reached a split in the trail. One path curved down toward what looked like a dry creek bed, while the other climbed up a narrow ridge. The map I'd printed from the internet didn't show either, but I chose the ridge, figuring I'd get a good view from the top. The climb wasn't easy. Loose soil and roots made it slow going, but the higher I went, the quieter it got. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, wind, faded bit by bit until all that was left was my own breathing and the creak of my pack straps. By the time I reached the top, I realized how far I'd gone. I couldn't see the road anymore, and the valley below was nothing but a sea of trees. I decided to rest for a while. The air was cooler up there, and I could see faint mist gathering in the lower parts of the forest. It was beautiful, but I remember feeling a strange heaviness in that quiet, the kind that doesn't feel peaceful but oppressive. I shrugged it off, ate a snack, and started descending on what I thought was the same side I'd come up. It wasn't. At first, the slope seemed familiar, but within 20 minutes the terrain changed completely. The trees were closer together, the undergrowth thicker, and the trail I'd been following faded away entirely. I tried backtracking, but every direction looked the same. I used my compass, but it didn't seem to line up with how I'd been walking earlier. I told myself not to panic, but that's easier said than done when you're alone and everything around you suddenly feels wrong. I decided to head downhill, figuring I'd hit a stream or a road eventually. I walked for what felt like hours, but the landscape didn't change much. The trees stayed dense, and the air got colder. I noticed the light dimming earlier than it should have. The canopy overhead was thick, but it was more than that. It felt like the daylight itself was thinning out. I checked my watch, and it said just after 5, but the forest looked like dusk. I started moving faster. The first sign that something was off was the smell. Faint at first, like damp earth and old decay, but it grew stronger the deeper I went. I thought maybe I'd stumbled near some animal remains. Then I found the ground itself changing. Patches of black soil, soft and uneven, mixed with bits of something gray and brittle. When I knelt to look, I realized they were fragments of bone, not large enough to be human, maybe deer or something smaller, but they were scattered across the ground in clusters. I tried not to think about it, told myself it was natural, maybe a predator's den nearby, but there was no sound. Nothing alive moved through those trees. No birds, no rustle of small creatures, not even wind anymore. I kept walking until I reached a narrow clearing with what looked like an old structure ahead. At first, I thought it was a cabin. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't exactly that, more like the remnants of one. A rectangular outline of logs sunken into the earth, half swallowed by moss and roots. The roof was gone, but the corners still stood, dark with rot. Inside, there was a pit that might have been a cellar entrance long ago, now filled with leaves and mud. I stared at it for a long time, unsure if I should keep moving or stop there for the night. The idea of sleeping near it made me uneasy, but I was exhausted and losing daylight fast. I decided to camp nearby, just within sight of the ruin, but not too close. That night was one of the longest of my life. I made a small fire and sat next to it, trying to keep warm. The forest around me stayed unnervingly silent, not a single sound except for the occasional crack of cooling wood. I tried to eat, but I had no appetite. I felt watched, though every time I looked around, there was nothing. Only the trees stretching in all directions, motionless. Sometime after midnight, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A faint shape, darker than the shadows, standing between the trees. I froze, staring at it, but when I blinked, it was gone. I stayed awake until dawn. When morning came, the fire was out, and the forest looked colorless in the weak light. My sense of direction was completely gone. I couldn't tell which way I'd come from or where the ridge was anymore. I packed up and started walking again, this time marking the trees with my knife, so I wouldn't loop back by mistake. But after a couple of hours, I saw one of my own marks on a tree that shouldn't have been in front of me. Somehow, I'd circled back without realizing it. That's when I started to panic for real. I tried using my compass again. The needle moved slowly, uncertainly, like it was being pulled between directions. I chose one and kept moving, ignoring everything else. I don't know how long I walked, maybe most of the day, but it started to rain in the afternoon, a cold, misty drizzle that soaked through my jacket. I saw shapes of ridges ahead and thought I'd finally found the edge of the forest, but every time I reached one, it just led to another slope beyond it. The smell of decay returned too, faint but constant. At one point, I looked down and saw what looked like a shoe buried in the mud. Old, cracked leather half swallowed by the ground. I didn't stop to dig it out. By the time the light faded again, I was delirious from exhaustion. I found a fallen tree to sit under and tried to make another fire, but everything was too wet. I ended up curling against my pack, shivering until morning. When I woke up, the fog was thick. I couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. That's when I heard something. It wasn't movement this time, but a low, steady sound, almost like breathing, but faint and rhythmic, coming from somewhere deep within the fog. I held still, thinking it was an animal, but the sound didn't move. It stayed in the same place, repeating, slow and deliberate. I waited for what felt like an hour, until the sound finally faded. That morning, I decided to keep walking no matter what. I was too weak to think clearly, but I knew I couldn't stay put. I kept heading in one direction until the fog finally began to thin, and through it, I saw something metallic glinting. It was an old fence, rusted wire stretched between wooden posts. I followed it, hoping it would lead to a clearing or road. It eventually opened into a field, and at the far end, I saw a gravel path. I followed it for nearly 2 miles before I finally heard a vehicle, an old pickup, driven by a local farmer who stopped when he saw me stumbling out of the woods. He gave me water and drove me to the nearest ranger station. I told them I'd gotten lost near Pine Hollow, but when they checked the maps, they said that part of the forest hadn't had official trails in decades. When I described the cabin ruin, one of the rangers said there used to be several old logging camps back in the 1940s, some of which burned down after a storm. He said it wasn't uncommon for people to get turned around there, that the land was uneven and easy to misread.